So on the agenda for today's presentation, we will review a recent HIPAA fine related to vulnerability assessments, briefly cover what a vulnerability assessment actually is, discuss why a vulnerability assessment is critical to HIPAA compliance, provide you with some things that can be done between vulnerability assessments to help maintain a secure posture, and finally a review of EC First's approach to vulnerability assessments. You can submit questions via the GoToWebinar question feature, and we will try to address as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. So is everyone excited? I'm going to pretend everyone shouted yes at the top of their lungs all at the same time. So a recent settlement shows how critical performing vulnerability assessments and then really remediating those findings really is. So Anchorage Community Mental Health Services paid a $150,000 fine due to a breach of EPHI directly related to not applying patches. So malware exploited known vulnerabilities in some out-of-date software, aka missing patches, to compromise over 2,700 people, or more specifically, the information for over 2,700 individuals. Performing a vulnerability assessment can identify missing patches. That is to say that part of performing a vulnerability assessment is to identify missing patches. So the assumption could be made that had Anchorage performed a comprehensive vulnerability assessment and then adequately addressed the findings, they may have been able to avoid the breach and then thus this $150,000 fine, and then really any other negative consequences that may have yet to come out of that breach. So as you can see here, that $150,000 that Anchorage paid was really kind of on that low end of some of the fines that OCR has handed down. And probably the most common cause of a breach, at least in my opinion, and not necessarily specific to EPHI and HIPAA, but maybe kind of breaches in general, but definitely with HIPAA, is represented on this slide here, and it's right there in the middle, and that's the lost laptop containing unencrypted EPHI or any sensitive data for that matter. So EC First really expects OCR to continue to increase the severity of penalties imposed for breaches, especially those related to an already fined root cause, such as an unencrypted laptop or medical records left unattended. So what is a vulnerability assessment? Well, according to Wikipedia, a vulnerability assessment is the process of identifying, quantifying, prioritizing, or ranking the vulnerabilities in a system. And a vulnerability can be thought of as a weakness that creates a risk if exploited. And that risk is usually related to the CIA triad, or confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So the goal of a vulnerability assessment is to identify these vulnerabilities so that the organization can adequately address them prior to exploitation by an attacker. So if you're not performing periodic vulnerability assessments, then it would be very difficult to know if you were adequately addressing these vulnerabilities. A vulnerability assessment really requires a comprehensive scope to be most effective. And EC First generally looks to address 4 main areas of access and access control. The external network, we look at the internal network, wireless networks, and then the firewall configuration, as that's really protecting those other networks. And it's within these different areas that we're attempting to identify various types of vulnerabilities. Now, that's not to say that this is how a vulnerability assessment must be scoped or broken down. This is just one way that EC First kind of breaks down the scope of a comprehensive vulnerability assessment. You could potentially scope an assessment to just one of these areas, really, if you wanted to. The key is ensuring that you've documented the scope so that it's clear what was, and just as importantly, what was not covered in the assessment. So when somebody's reviewing the reports and the findings, they have context of how these things were discovered, and also areas where things may not have been discovered. So within the 4 areas of a vulnerability assessment scope, we're trying to identify a number of different types of vulnerabilities. So there's vulnerabilities that most of us are familiar with related to systems and software. And these are the types of vulnerabilities that are usually remediated with a patch or a configuration change. Then there are information leakage vulnerabilities that can provide an attacker with valuable information. So metadata always comes to mind, or data about data, because it's really kind of a perfect example, as most documents today contain metadata. So, for example, Microsoft Word documents contain all kinds of information about the document itself embedded within the document. So, such as the version of Microsoft Word that was used to create that document. You might have the username of the person that actually created the document, or maybe the full path to where that file was last saved. And so all of this is really great information for an attacker, as it helps them to kind of further or focus an attack, as now I know I have some specific criteria I can go after. And then there are the website and web application vulnerabilities. And these types of issues are becoming much more prevalent as more sites kind of process user input as part of that user experience. And so if you think of kind of back in the day, right, websites were really mostly static. You would go to a site, consume some content, maybe click on a link to some more content for you to consume, but really that was it. Now most websites are really a lot more like applications, in that they process user input and then generate output based either on that input or the results of the processing. So Facebook, for example, performs all kinds of processing on user input when you really think about it. I mean, they're processing everything from user posts to status updates to site searches to file and image uploads. And so that's where we start to discover a lot of these kind of vulnerabilities related to that processing of user input and malicious inputs in particular. Then there's identity and access management vulnerabilities that really relate to poor user management when you really get down to the root cause. Active Directory just kind of serves to centralize these poor user management practices. So things such as not setting user accounts so that passwords have to be changed periodically. We see that all the time. Or granting a bunch of users kind of these admin level rights, or like domain admin group memberships, another thing that we see a lot. Then there's also user passwords, are another area that we find kind of vulnerabilities, either related to the password policy that's been defined itself, or users just choosing weak passwords. So I'm sure that we're all kind of well aware of the password policy best practice settings of like a minimum of 8 characters, right? And you have to use 3 of the 4 character categories, such as uppercase and lowercase and a number and a symbol. But the password, for example, of password1 with a capital P meets all of those requirements, but it's a horrible password. I guarantee if that's your password, I'm going to guess it very quickly. And if you're not performing, a comprehensive vulnerability assessment to address these types of vulnerabilities, how would you know that your users have such horrible passwords other than after you get compromised and realize that your users had horrible passwords. So kind of recently in the news, at least preliminarily, the information seems to point that compromised passwords or compromised user accounts were the cause of that recent Anthem compromise. And we find that many times the compromise of one account can actually lead to the compromise of multiple accounts. So on every single one of my vulnerability assessments that I've done over the years, we find at least 2 accounts using the same or a very similar weak password. A lot of times this is due to the common practice of setting new user accounts to the same easy-to-guess default password, like password1 or let me in or welcome123. That's another one we see a lot, winter 2014. So if that user doesn't log in to change that password in a relatively reasonable amount of time, then that's essentially a free account for an attacker. If I'm an attacker and I get access to your internal network, one of the first things I'm going to try and do is get a hold of some valid user accounts and try to guess those user account passwords to get myself some quote-unquote legitimate access. A couple other vulnerability types that we're looking for during our vulnerability assessments include data access vulnerabilities, so such as folders containing sensitive data that allow anyone to have read access. That one thing right there, that actually happens a lot more than you would think. And it's either, kind of users saving information to an unapproved location, or more commonly, organizations not even having a policy related, to sensitive information and its storage. So on a vulnerability assessment for one client semi-recently, I had actually stumbled upon a server that would temporarily cache the registration documentation for the hospital, for checking in new patients, right? So they would fill out this kind of electronic form when they were checking someone in, and then that form temporarily got cached on this server prior to it getting picked up by some other automated process. The files kind of remained on that system, and this was a system that I was able to access anonymously long enough for me to easily copy them off. And really this was kind of a twofold issue of the system not being securely configured, as well as IT not really being aware where sensitive information was being stored or transmitted. When we brought this to their attention, they had no idea that this server was caching this information. So if I'm an attacker, those files give me some really great information, like your full name, your date of birth, your address, maybe even your social security number, most likely your insurance provider at least. So that's really good stuff if I want to try and steal your identity or commit, medical insurance fraud. And then there are network access issues, such as using WEP on a wireless network, or firewall rules that might allow access from any source to any destination on any port. They're really not as restrictive as they should be. So for WEP in particular, if you don't already know, WEP is very weak and should not be used on wireless networks. So there are a number of known weaknesses with WEP. And because of those weaknesses, it's very easy to crack, so it's no longer recommended in any shape or form to be used. I actually read an article a while back that had said the FBI can crack WEP regardless of your key size in under 3 minutes. It's pretty fast. I've cracked WEP a number of times, both for the fun of it and on our client engagements. And I think the fastest that I was ever able to crack somebody's legitimate WEP password was 5 minutes. Again, that's still pretty fast for me to now gain unauthorized access to your wireless network, which a lot of times equates to unauthorized access to your internal network. So now, just as important as identifying the vulnerabilities is actually addressing the vulnerabilities. And this can be done by eliminating, reducing, transferring, or accepting the risk. These are generally accepted as the ways that you can go about addressing risks. And in eliminating or reducing the risk, there's generally kind of two technical approaches that I think about. So the first would be to apply a patch, like when Microsoft pushes out updates on the first Tuesday of every month, right? Quote unquote Patch Tuesday. So a vendor, not just Microsoft, but so a vendor states, you know, hey, there's a vulnerability in their software. There's a patch available for you to apply that would fix the issue. So you download the patch and install that said patch, and now you've eliminated or reduced the risk related to that vulnerability. The second way is to make a change to the configuration itself. So for example, SSL version 2 is known to have several weaknesses, kind of like web. And you can update the configuration of a system or a server so that SSL version 2 is no longer available for use. So thus you've kind of now eliminated any vulnerabilities related to SSL version 2 by changing the server configuration to not allow it to be used. And then there are times when it's just best to accept the risk of a vulnerability, such as a self-signed certificate on a non-critical internal system. You may have an organization decide that the cost and time and effort related to putting a valid certificate on this internal system outweighs the risk of having that self-signed certificate, so you may decide that you're just going to accept that risk. And then transferring the risk, just kind of for the sake of completeness, could be accomplished by a number of things. Some examples are like obtaining insurance, or having a third party, physically host systems to kind of shift all of those physical risks onto that third party. So now for a little more information about EC First. All of the services that are offered by EC First, and we do offer a number of services, as you can see here, can all be found on our cybersecurity portal. That's available at www.ecfirst.com/cyber. And with over 2,100 clients served, EC First provides a unique business-driven compliance and security solution, and is home to the HIPAA Academy, which provides some really great training opportunities, especially focused on HIPAA. So there's the Certified HIPAA Professional, or the CHP training class and certification. That does things like stepping through all the major sections of HIPAA High-Tech, the Omnibus Final Rule, examining HIPAA privacy and security rules, reviewing HIPAA compliance challenges, and walking through kind of best practice definitions for addressing various HIPAA compliance standards and implementation specifications. And for a wider kind of look in or study into compliance, EC First also offers the Certified Security Compliance Specialist, or CSCS, training and certification. So it's more of a deep dive into high-tech and the HIPAA security rule. You cover things like FISMA and NERC and GLDA, PCI DSS. Look at some international standards like ISO 27001, 27002. Cover a number of different state information security related regulations, especially California. They're kind of on the tip of the spear when it comes to legislation for the protection of personal information. We'll also cover a number of different NIST standards, NIST kind of being the go-to source for information security best practices. So we offer a number of classes across the country throughout the year. Here you can see 3 upcoming classes that we have. I know, being based in Iowa, and I'll look out the window right now at all the snow and negative temperatures that we have in Las Vegas in December, is sounding pretty nice right now. If you actually take the CHP and the CSCS class together, you'll save $450 by bundling those. So definitely something to look into. So now, why is a vulnerability assessment critical to HIPAA compliance, right? Kind of the crux of this webinar today. So why is it so critical? Well, first off, HIPAA requires an annual risk assessment. So it's kind of that simple. A comprehensive risk assessment includes a comprehensive vulnerability assessment. Because it would be really hard to say that you've addressed all of the risks if you haven't performed a vulnerability assessment to identify those technical risks. And as we've seen, there are many different types of vulnerabilities. This is more than just, hey, we checked for missing patches. You know, if knock on wood, hopefully you're not, but if you're ever audited by OCR, they're going to want to see the results of your most recent risk assessment. And those results better also contain the results of a recent vulnerability assessment. This helps to show, you know, that you're addressing or identifying all of the risks or making the effort to identify all of the risks. Because kind of without performing that technical vulnerability assessment as part of your risk assessment, it's like you really only have half of your security story. This would be like taking your car to a mechanic for a tune-up, but then not having them check the engine, right? You take it in, you say, hey, I want you to give this a good look over, but whatever you do not open the hood. Like, you know, you're probably going to be missing a lot of things. That guy's probably going to miss some critical things. Same thing, if you're doing a risk assessment, and part of that doesn't include a comprehensive vulnerability assessment, you should know you're missing a lot of things. Plus, I mean, it's in the rules, right? There are a number of HIPAA standards and implementation specifications that deal with performing vulnerability assessments. So a few examples, risk analysis and risk management both have aspects that pertain to performing vulnerability assessments and addressing their results. And vulnerability assessments can help evaluate things like password management practices, you know, that we talked about a little bit earlier. The evaluation standard specifically calls for a technical evaluation, aka a vulnerability assessment. So at least in my mind, you really need no other justification on why you need to perform a vulnerability assessment for HIPAA other than the evaluation standard, right? It says it right there. I mean, it specifically calls for a technical evaluation. The other related standards and implementation specifications can kind of help to define and justify your scope, right? So this is why we need to look at Active Directory and identity and access management to identify issues related to user identification, or this is why we need to check password policies and user-defined passwords so we can find out any risks related to password management. So once a vulnerability assessment has identified the vulnerability, then you have to address those vulnerabilities. We said it a few times now, and this goes back to the 4 ways that you can address a vulnerability that we had mentioned earlier, right? So you can eliminate, reduce, transfer, or accept the risk. And this has that dual benefit of potentially protecting you, right, from a compromise or a breach, but then also demonstrating that you were doing everything that you could to protect your systems and your data. The caveat, if you will, with this, as with most things HIPAA, and I think we've kind of said this before, maintain documentation. So you're going to have a report from this vulnerability assessment that should be documenting the vulnerabilities that were identified. And likewise, you should be maintaining documentation on how you address those vulnerabilities. You know, that's kind of the saying, the proof is in the pudding, right? You want to be able to prove what was found and what you did to address it. And maintaining documentation on how you addressed various vulnerabilities can actually speed up future remediation efforts, you know, should the same or similar vulnerabilities be found in the future. So for example, recently issues were found with SSL version 3, and it started off with one issue. And then shortly after that one issue was discovered, there were other issues discovered related to that initial issue, and some of these were kind of dubbed poodle vulnerability, if you want to Google that later. And so, if you had documented, say you immediately addressed the original SSL version 3 vulnerability, and so if you had documented how you addressed that one, then you could use that knowledge and that documentation to quickly decide how best to address these other issues that were pretty closely related to that original issue. So you need to perform a vulnerability assessment at least annually. But to me, the two keywords there are at least, right, or AKA the bare minimum. If you're only doing it annually, you're doing the bare minimum. And really, when you think about it, a year is a really long time, especially in the security industry. New vulnerabilities are discovered every day. And if you're only addressing security this one time a year after your vulnerability assessment, you're really kind of putting yourself at high risk for a compromise. So we're going to review kind of a couple things that can and probably really should be done by your organization on a periodic basis to help maintain your security posture in between these kind of formal vulnerability assessments. These items kind of represent the majority of system vulnerabilities that EC First discovers on a vulnerability assessment. Like if you were to come up to me on the street and say, hey Ben, what are a couple of things I can do to help maintain a secure posture? I would probably say, well, guy, I don't know. I would recommend these next two things to you. And so while I wouldn't necessarily, call these quote unquote quick wins, as there's definitely some effort that goes into these, they will also definitely help you to increase or maintain your security posture. So a big source of compromise, when an attacker exploits a vulnerability to compromise a system, the vast majority of the time, it was a known vulnerability that was exploited. And many times, there was actually already a patch available to remediate the vulnerability. If you think back about Anchorage, this is kind of that boat that Anchorage had found themselves in, right? Missing patches for known out-of-date software. And this is why you should be periodically checking for and installing missing patches provided by vendors. How long you can wait, to apply available patches will really vary by your organization and your organization's risk acceptance level. But 30 to 60 days after a release is pretty common. This provides you time to test the patches prior to widespread deployment. And it's usually the justification given for delaying patches. Hey, the reason we don't apply patches immediately when they come out is we need time to test them for negative side effects. Even if you don't, have a formal patch testing process as part of your patch deployment process, waiting that 30 to 60 days does allow other organizations to identify kind of issues or negative side effects with these patches before you deploy them in your network. But you really need to make sure that these patches are successfully and fully applied. So as I'm sure that many folks are aware, that a lot of the Microsoft patches require a reboot before that patch is really fully applied. So that means that until that reboot happens, this system is technically still vulnerable to whatever vulnerability you were trying to fix with the patch. So you need to develop a process to check for missing patches, and I would say at least monthly. There are many tools out there, for checking for missing Microsoft patches or missing patches in general. Thinking specifically from Microsoft, there's the Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer, or MBSA. It's free to download, it's free to use, It'll check for missing Microsoft patches along with some other Microsoft OS specific security issues, and it can even check for things specific to like missing SQL Server service packs and things like that. But checking for missing OS patches is one thing, but you also need to be checking for and applying missing patches for third-party software like Java and Flash. Some patch deployment tools aren't really able to check for missing third-party patches. The MBSA one is a good example. It can't check for missing patches in non-Microsoft software. And you also don't want to just rely on Microsoft's Patch Tuesday as your trigger to check for and apply missing patches. Obviously, you need to be aware of when Patch Tuesday is and know that there'll be patches coming out on that day. But instead, it's kind of better to proactively monitor for new vulnerabilities and missing patches. And so one resource for that is the SANS Institute runs the Internet Storm Center, which provides daily diaries about current IT security-related issues. They also have information about new vulnerabilities that were discovered, as well as a good analysis of Microsoft's patches that they release on Patch Tuesday. It's a good non-biased overview of the criticality of those Microsoft patches. And so if ISC, if the Internet Storm Center says that a patch is like patch now, you can better believe that we're telling all of our clients, hey, this is a patch you need to deploy sooner rather than later. We've provided the URL to ISC here, isc.sans.edu. And now this whole process of checking for missing patches and deploying missing patches and validating, patch installs. You can do this manually, I suppose, but it would be an administrative nightmare for anything beyond just a couple of machines. Thankfully, there's a number of tools out there to kind of help automate the patch deployment process or whole patch management process, if you will, both paid and open source tools. We've listed out a couple examples here on the slide, and these are no way necessarily like EC first recommendations or best of breed when it comes to patch deployment or patch management, but these are a few very, well-known players in that area. And so the next recommendation, when it comes to classifying vulnerabilities, I would really say that the #1 type of vulnerability that we discover relates to insecure system configurations. And so these are the issues that usually aren't fixed by applying a patch, but instead a change to the system configuration kind of remediates the issue. So the example of SSL version 2 we provided earlier was one such type of vulnerability, in that you would update the configuration of that system to disable the use of SSL version 2, thus removing that risk. And even if a vulnerability by itself doesn't allow an attacker to, say, take direct control of a system or have remote code execution, that's a good buzzword in the industry, it could still represent a higher or an elevated risk. So we might find a system that allows null sessions, which by itself doesn't necessarily allow full system access, but we use this vulnerability to identify some valid usernames and the domain password policy. So now we know how to adjust our password guessing attempts to fit the defined password policy, and now we have a listing of valid user accounts that we can target. I mean, why would I guess passwords that are 6 characters if the password policy defines a minimum of 8 characters? Why waste all of that effort? Or if the password policy says that accounts are locked after 20 failed login attempts, okay, well then I'm going to adjust my tools so that I'm only making 19 attempts, in the allotted time frame. And so we're going to guess one of these account passwords. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. And then we're going to log into a workstation with that account. and then now elevate our access level to that of an administrator on that workstation using an out-of-date version of Adobe Reader that was installed, right? That's a pretty common kind of a vulnerability chain. And so you can see that by chaining those vulnerabilities together, we quickly went from just information leakage to an actual kind of system compromise. We're now an administrator on a workstation. And then, from there, your network's my oyster. So probably one of the best ways to address these insecure system configurations is with baseline configuration standards. The goal is to define a configuration baseline for all system types that will be deployed on your network. This way you can ensure that systems are properly configured and hardened prior to them being deployed on the network. The Center for Internet Security, or CIS, they're a great resource, as they've already defined these baseline configurations or benchmarks for many system types. And the good thing is that these benchmarks are already accepted as configuration best practice. So like a lot of the initial legwork has been done for you. So we've provided the link to the CIS benchmarks website. These benchmarks, they're free to use, they're free to download. So you just navigate to benchmarks.cisecurity.org/downloads/benchmarks. But one thing to keep in mind is that the CIS benchmarks are really to be used as a starting point for your configuration definitions. They're going to have to be customized for your network, your systems, and your organizations. And when you have a system that inevitably will have to deviate from the baseline, because it's going to happen. You're going to define these really secure and hardened baselines, and for a lot of systems to work or to function as needed, you're going to have to make some exceptions to that hardened state. And so when you have a system that deviates from the baseline, then you document, hey, here's what the deviation is, here's the valid business justification. So for example, the CIS benchmark for Windows Server 2008, say, will have configuration settings to disable unneeded services like SMTP. But if you're deploying an email server, you're going to need to have SMTP enabled, right? So what you would do is you would document that server XYZ has the SMTP service enabled on port 25 to provide email services. And then additionally, those baselines need to be updated periodically to ensure that they continually represent best practice. We recommend a quarterly update that kind of allows you to add any required patches, security-related patches that may have been released since the last update. So this way you can ensure that not only are the systems configured securely, but that when they're put onto the network, they also have all of the required security patches that you've approved. So wrapping up, the EC First approach to vulnerability assessments. EC First provides a tiered approach to performing vulnerability assessments, or at least the option. And you can see here that we have offerings from our bronze vulnerability assessment that is really limited in scope for those with specific external systems that they need testing on, all the way to our platinum vulnerability assessment that is comprehensive in scope and addresses all of the kind of the 4 areas that we discussed previously. So you can see that we're hitting the external network, the internal network, the wireless network, reviewing the firewall configuration. Obviously, in the platinum, you're getting a detailed analysis of all of our findings. You get a corrective action plan, which is a line item by line item, every vulnerability that was discovered, the systems that it was discovered on, and then from a high level, what needs to be done to remediate that issue. And then we even provide you detailed remediation steps that kind of expand on that high level and give you step-by-step directions on what you need to do to remediate the issue. And so EC First really finds that most of the organizations we engage with are really best served by kind of taking this tiered approach to vulnerability assessments. And you can see here, this is a usual phase offering that we present to most of our clients. Do gold, then we transition to a platinum, and then after that, hopefully now you're ready for penetration test, right? A good buzzword there, penetration test. And the goal is to, over the course of a few years, to improve the organization's security posture and capabilities so that at the end of a multi-year engagement, the organization will hopefully be positioned to, address security issues proactively as opposed to reactively as a result of the vulnerability assessments. The reason we recommend the tiered approach for most organizations is that we found that our silver or gold level vulnerability assessments, while slightly limited in scope, still adequately identify vulnerabilities without overwhelming staff with remediation activities. So as a special offer to anyone who joined the webinar today, EC First will actually perform a bronze vulnerability assessment for your organization at the discounted price of $795. And that's if you sign up for the assessment by 5 p.m. Pacific today. So it's a really good deal, $795, and you at least get your external network checked out. So you can contact Lorna Wagner, whose contact information is presented on the slide, to schedule that assessment. I would highly recommend emailing instead of trying to call. Lorna is obviously a very, very busy person, and you'll probably get a much more timely response. So that brings us to any questions that we were planning on covering. We will these slides for this presentation will be available, and a link to these slides will actually get emailed out to everybody that was in attendance. So let's see what some questions that we have. Is a vulnerability assessment the same as a penetration test? And that's actually a really good question, and it comes up a lot, and there's a lot of confusion in there, and no, they are not the same. It's best to think of a vulnerability assessment as part of a penetration test, right? So when I go to do a penetration test, I'm going to do a vulnerability assessment as part of me trying to identify what things should I attack. But the big difference is a vulnerability assessment its goal is to identify vulnerabilities, and then that's it. That's where it stops. Provide recommendations, but that's where it stops. A penetration test would pick up and try to actually exploit identified vulnerabilities to help identify and enumerate the actual risk involved. Are there operating systems that are inherently more vulnerable than others? This could quickly lead to an OS flame. So I would say I'm going to kind of pass the buck on that without calling it. I mean, I think most of us realize who puts out more updates for their operating systems more often. In my opinion, it starts with micro and ends with oft. But that is to say there are plenty of vulnerabilities found in Linux systems as well. Just Windows, Microsoft has such a large market share that they're just always at the forefront. Same with Mac OS. There's vulnerabilities in it, believe you me. They just don't have the market share to bring those vulnerabilities to the forefront of the public attention like Windows does at this point. Patches sometimes break apps. Very good point. And so that's why, kind of when we were talking about pushing out patches, there's that recommendation of waiting 30 to 60 days. And really the whole point of that waiting is for you to test those patches. So ideally, your organization would have a production network and then a development or test network. And so you would then be testing these patches in that dev or test network prior to deployment. Ideally, that's the process that every organization is using. In the real world, it doesn't always happen that way. A lot of times it's just too expensive or too involved to have that secondary development or test network that matches your production network. And so then in that case, you just kind of have to try and test as best you can. or just kind of keep an eye on those patches and see if other folks within that 30 to 60 days have identified any other negative side effects. Are there tools? I'm not sure exactly what that one, oh, here's another one that follows up. Are there tools that I can use to conduct my own high-level assessment? Yes, there's all kinds of vulnerability assessment tools out there. Two to name would be Nexpose and Nessus. Both have a free offering. Nexpose is called the Community Edition, and we actually use a version of Nexpose in our vulnerability assessment. There's also others out there, Qualys, OpenVAS. For the most part, they all operate the same. They generally find the same vulnerabilities. It just comes down to what you're most comfortable with, what works best for you. What's the difference between a risk assessment and a vulnerability assessment? Another good question. A vulnerability assessment is really more technical in nature, so it's looking at technical issues. A risk assessment is more people, processes, procedures. So a risk assessment, that would be somebody coming in and talking, interviewing people, going through your policies, going through your procedures, figure out how things are actually done within your organization. The risk assessment is coming in and looking at systems and networks and devices and trying to identify technical vulnerabilities. Let's see. Is there a standardized tool for vulnerability assessments? I don't know that necessarily anything standardized, maybe not the best term, but there's those four that I went over, Qualys, Nexpose, Nessus, OpenVAS. Those are four industry accepted as kind of best in breed vulnerability scanners. Let's see. In regards to client server or hosted electronic health records programs, is still necessary if the system is cloud-based? Yes. So just because a system is in the cloud doesn't mean that your responsibilities for protection and configuration of that system have gone away. Now you'd want to look at it because you've probably transferred a lot of risk moving that stuff to the cloud, but you still need to get either assurances from the cloud provider documenting how they're securely configuring your devices, or if you're still managing the device in the cloud itself, obviously then you'd be applying your baseline configuration standards. But yeah, that is one thing. A lot of folks kind of have this notion that, oh, well, if we move it to the cloud, then all of our risk is gone. Well, not really. Part of your risk is probably gone, or at least transferred. But there's still going to be risk associated. And especially within the guise of HIPAA, the key thing is making sure that cloud provider has a business associated agreement. So I believe that has us at the end of our presentation. As we stated, we will be emailing a link out to the email address that you used to register for this webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for their time. Again, just a reminder that you can contact Lorna Wagner if you would like to take advantage of the $795 bronze vulnerability assessment offering. Thanks again for your time, everyone, and have a good afternoon.